It is the part of Europe that is known for setting sail. It was once a Roman colony and is now quite an interesting place. Today we're talking about the Iberian Peninsula, otherwise once known as Hispania. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Geopolitics with Tyberius D. Bit of a long thing going on here, so I'm going to catch you guys up here in just a second. But I am here with Daddy Marks. Daddy Marks, it's good to see you again. How you been, man?
I've been great, man. I've been great. Happy to be back on the show again. It's been a little bit.
It's been a little bit, but it's been a little bit for everybody. So, the last show that we did aired on, I can't remember. Was it Monday or something? Okay. For those listening to the podcast, it's always 2 days behind when we record the show, but we haven't recorded a show since last Wednesday, so a full week from a week ago. Now, we were going to do one on Friday, and I just got stupid busy over the weekend, and then it's been a lot of things. So there was an event that happened on Friday which really upset me, and it kicked off my depressive phase. And so I've just been in a whole rut where I don't want to deal with anybody or do anything or that kind of thing. Now, I didn't really realize it for that first day or two because I was a combination of angry and busy to where I really just didn't realize, oh, hey, you're in your different state. But it's definitely that case. And we're actually, for the people who are watching the show or who are listening later, we're starting a full 45 minutes late. And it's just one of those deals where, like, I'm obviously not in the dress shirt. I'm just in a little hoodie. There's a level that I just still don't give a damn. So, thank you for being here. I appreciate everyone that is here for part of the audience, and I appreciate anyone who is listening on the show. I do apologize for not being a consistent content maker, but there are times where I just need to stop and I need to take a break or, whatever. And I do apologize because I know that was recently on vacation, but yeah, here we are. So as far as all that is considered, I do have to shout out our good friends who are our patrons, Fallenor, Andy Wagner, The West Dude, Julia, Drew, and Samantha. You guys help make this show fantastic. You help bring this all together. And so I appreciate all the work that you guys do and all all the ways that you have supported us. And I hope you continue to do so in the days to come. So today we're talking about the Roman province of Hispania, or what we call the Iberian Peninsula, or Iberia, or what we largely now know as Spain and Portugal. So, before we begin, is there anything that you want to know or that you want to touch on, Marks?
No, I don't know that much about Liberia, so I'm interested to learn.
All right.
Maybe.
All right, so the history here can go back quite a ways. Now, sometimes I don't like to get back to Roman history because that's not really where what we think of these countries really starts, right? Like when I do France, I didn't go all the way back to Gaul to a large degree, or I think I might have mentioned it. Spain's got the same kind of thing going on, where modern Spain, modern Iberia, I mean, it's got different layers that it kind of builds out with, but just to kind of flash it through. It was Celtic in the same way that Gaul and is it Celtic? I can't think for a second here. I'm so sorry. I gotta make the difference between the people who were in these regions before and after, because when the Romans show up, they become a different people. They don't become Latin.
I'm looking it up. It's saying that Celtic tribes did migrate to Spain, and at the time it was known as the Iberian Peninsula. So yeah.
Yeah. I gotta remember. Okay. I know what it is. They were the Celts, and then they were turned into what we kind of call the Gaelic peoples. by the Romans. They were kind of like semi-Romanized, if you will, but they were never like truly Roman. Um, and they kind of have the same thing go on. And then in the same way that the Brits and the French and this region gets a whole group of people that were what we would consider Germans, they show up. And these are particularly, if I remember, for Spain, it's the Visigoths. And they come into Spain and they kind of set up shop. And they'll rule the roost for a bit. Now, the difference between what we'll see in France and Hispania is that in France, you don't have one particular group of people show up that do in Hispania, and that is the Caliphate. Now, I can't remember which one it is, like the Umayyad Caliphate or what have you, but there are the Moors and the Berbers and the Moors and a whole bunch of other people show up from North Africa. And it's kind of like a reverse invasion where usually everyone goes south. Well, actually, the North Africans come north, and they bring this little religion that we now know as Islam to the place. The long story short is about 50 years they'll conquer most of the peninsula. Actually, they'll probably conquer all of it, if I remember right. And then they actually get into France, and then it's actually Charles the Hammer who stops them and starts kind of reversing the trend. And you'll get what is known as the Reconquista. It is 700 years of the Christians trying to take back the Hispania, or the Iberian Peninsula. They will succeed. There is very little Islamic influence still left, and it's highly, highly Catholic. But this is literally 700 years of their history, where they're literally just pressing back the presence and the influence of Islam throughout Hispania. And that's actually a good, significant part of their modern history. And if you will, it's kind of the formation of their modern history. So this will largely start in like the 800s is when this back pressure starts going out. And it won't be until like 1453, 1456, something like that, when Granada is finally the last outpost is actually taken back. And the Christendom of Hispania has finished. So that's the level of time frame that we're talking about here. And there's a lot of things that happen during this time, which there is the formation of the Kingdom of Glacilia. There is the formation of Leon and Aragon and Castile, which was known as something else before that. There was Leon, and there was... I can't remember what this other one is. There's a lot of these different like titular kingdoms that kind of form out during this time, and they'll all form out into stuff that we kind of know today. But Aragon is largely based out of Catalonia, which there's a whole conversation there entirely. But you'll have all of these areas kind of form out, and then they'll become supercharged by somebody else, and they'll form new kingdoms to where like Leon and I can't remember what this other one was, but they'll form the Kingdom of Castile. And then the Kingdom of Castile and Aragon will eventually form the Kingdom of Spain. And you'll have this one other outlier here, which was the Principality of Lisboa, which becomes Portugal and Lisbon. There's so much here that's there. Go ahead, sir.
Was it Navarre that you were talking?
Navarro? No. Navarra is the Basque Country, which is their own people. And it's actually really weird. They're like the only actual Celtic people that still exist in Europe outside of the Irish. In the same way, like the Picts, which became the Scots, the Irish, which were like the I can't remember what they called them, like the Druidic Irish that only recently kind of got wiped out. The Basque people, like by heritage and ethno-linguistic heritage, are like the only Celtic people left. So they're like the actual holdover from pre-Roman times. Now they've been pretty much assimilated in one way or another by the powers that be, whether it's the French or the Spanish, into what we kind of think of as the modern era, but they are not 100% on board with all this shit. And there are some secessionist problems that come up from time to time. But we'll table that particular conversation. But do remind me to get back to Catalonia, and do remind me to get back to the Basque country, because it's actually relevant. Where we go from here is that largely with the rise of Christendom back into Hispania, it's that it's a slow moving march where it's literally just little bit by little bit that they take over, and you can watch as a map. It's literally like they just slowly paint the entire place back over 700 years. But they'll get it. They will, through blood, sweat, and tears, the Christians will take back, and then you eventually get to 3 major kingdoms in Hispania when that is done. And that is Portugal, that is Castile, and that is Aragon. And what you have is not long after this, if not just a little bit, I'm pretty sure not long after you have Granada fall and the last vestige of the Moors get wiped out, you will have what is known as the Iberian Wedding, and that is where the King of Castile and the Queen of Aragon get married, and their kids will be the sole inheritors of the entire realm, and they have a new name for this realm, and it's called Spain. And so 3 become 2. But Portugal was always the smallest one of these anyway, and then you basically get the super country. Now, a lot of people ask, why does Portugal never brought into this? 2 reasons. One, Spain just kind of screwed it up every single time that they tried. And number 2, Britain. England and then later Britain would largely guarantee the independence of Portugal. They had a lot in common, and it was one of those deals where the Brits largely saw that an independent Portugal, and one that they could work with, was really good as an intermediary when dealing with people that didn't like the British, but also in dealing with basically keeping Spain in check. And there's a long story short here as well, but just to show you how much the British don't like the Spanish, they've got this little base at the tip of southern Spain called Gibraltar, and they've had it for 300 years, and they've never given it back, just because they hate the Spanish. Now, there's a lot of political nonsense in there that I'm completely overgoing with, but I mean, even with the days of like the EU and all this, to where, you know, we've seen territories and whatnot remended, and people are supposed to go on referendums and all this stuff. Gibraltar's still British. And it's quite a rub to Spain. The Spanish are still pissed about this. But I'm going to guess, Marks, that you actually know a bit about this.
Yeah, I know a little bit. So the history I know, I can't remember the war, but originally Britain conquered that region of Gibraltar. I can't remember the reason why. I believe Spain took it back for a little bit, and then Britain. By the way, correct me if I'm getting any of this wrong. And then Britain finally took it back, and then took it back for like a final time, and then Spain just didn't bother anymore. And then like even after decolonization, like throughout the 60s and 70s, like out of spite, like Britain just didn't give up Gibraltar, and most of Gibraltar now speaks English anyway, so like the culture is pretty British there. It's like really weird.
A large degree, yes. I can't say whether Gibraltar got taken and taken back. I can't speak to that, but there's been enough wars where I could totally believe it. Like the Spanish and the British have fought a crap ton of wars. That's largely no longer the case for the last 200 years, but back during the imperial era, with Spain on the decline and England on the ascendancy, that wasn't the case. They would fight a war literally at all times, which we'll get to here in just a second. But yeah, Gibraltar's a little fun piece of trivial history, which is absolutely great. So let's roll this back, shall we? With the rise of Spain, you have Spain just kind of drop on the map. You guys know this guy named Christopher Columbus, right? He is actually sent out by the Queen of Aragon, this is the time when Spain is actually becoming. This is after the Iberian Wedding, but it's not where their kids have inherited the throne. And so, I believe it's Isabella of Spain, but you might want to double check that for me. Since this guy, jackass, actually, like in history, this guy is an absolute piece of shit. Um, no, Christopher Columbus, even by even the standards of his own day, is kind of seen as a complete asshole. Um, anyway, so CC goes off to the New World and basically claims it for Spain, and you'll have the conquistadors. You guys familiar with this, I hope, from your history. They'll show up into the New World and they will claim ridiculous swaths of the New World in favor of Spain. Now, there's a treaty that's largely signed between the Spanish and the Portuguese as far as colonial rights, and it's anything that's on the other side of the Prime Meridian, if I remember right. No, not the Prime Meridian. Excuse me. There is a line that they drew on longitude, to where anything east of that would be owned by the Portuguese, and anything west of that would be owned by the Spanish. So we'll put it down this. Everything that was in New Spain, and that's everything from literally California. Excuse me. I've just noticed that I was having some optical issues. We better fix that. Everything north of everything from in the north of California all the way down to freaking Argentina was part of New Spain. It was ridiculous, right? These are the people who conquered the Mayans, who conquered the Inca, who conquered the Aztec, or maybe not the Mayans. I think the Mayans actually flew apart a little bit before that. I apologize. Let me ignore that for a second. We'll just move on to the next part, right? So these entire areas are put under Spain. The only places that are left over from not being part of this is Brazil, because it turns out the Spanish didn't get to screw over the Portuguese completely, and so the Portuguese got this area that we now call Brazil. And then what they couldn't enforce is that they were literally so spread out over a continent and a half, is that they couldn't get the eastern seaboard of North America, which would later become the United States and Canada. And other people got there. It was the English and the Dutch and the Swedes and the French, and everyone showed up, right? But the long and the short here is that we would eventually see in that region the English and the French be the final two, between them and the Spanish, and then eventually it would be, of course, the Anglos that would win out that fight. But anyway, this whole colonial empire with Mexico all the way down to Argentina was incredibly powerful. And this is the height of Spain. Spain was stupidly wealthy. This is the time of the Spanish Armada, if you've heard of that. This is the time where the 30 Years' War happens, and Spain and Austria just absolutely hammer the Protestants. What happens? People ask later, all right, cool, Spain used to be this big super empire, but they don't really know how it fell apart, right? Well, and it kind of goes the same way that the British Empire goes to crap, unironically. They bite off a lot more than they can chew. Which, I'll put it this way. So Spain had, at one point, Naples under its control, which was like the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies with the same borders, actually. But this is basically everything from Naples south in Italy is under their control. They will, at one point, get the Spanish Netherlands, which was the Austrian Netherlands, and it'll actually break apart during the 30 Years' War to become the Netherlands, which we talked about in the very last episode, the Benelux. Go check that out. Anyway, to go long story short here is that Spain is fighting everywhere at every point. They're fighting in the 30 Years' War against the Protestants. They are fighting in the New World to keep their colonial possessions from the native uprisings that will happen from time to time, or the pressure there. They need to garrison it. Eventually, you get the British and the French and everybody else who will be showing up and trying to just pry off a little bit here and there, and bring out their own colonial possessions. Which particularly the British will get very, very powerful and competent in screwing with the Spanish at every given point possible. In fact, actually, the Golden Age of Piracy is coming up here. This is largely in the late 1500s, early 1600s, that this is going to happen. And so this is, literally the Spanish treasure fleet ships and the Spanish treasure fleets, to where they're just bringing oodles and oodles of gold over back to Spain. This is actually that time. This is when this is all happening right now. But what is different what is going to end for this is that the Spanish are basically overextended. They can't consolidate these imperial possessions into a cohesive whole that is working for them, and that'll get bled off. You'll have, excuse me, what am I thinking of? You'll have like the Spanish Netherlands eventually fall to Holland, which is the Netherlands themselves, the Dutch people. You'll have Italy, or you'll have Naples eventually be able to break away. I can't remember the history on that. I apologize. And then Spain has its own issues. They have the War of Spanish Secession, which has Spain and France just duking it out with everybody. There's numerous and numerous things in history here. But one of the big things that kind of, I would say, signals the beginning and the end is actually the 30 Years' War, all the way back then. Because you'll see the Spanish Netherlands actually become the Netherlands, for one. But two is that the Protestants will win the 30 Years' War. Now, part of this is because literally the freaking French will pay the Swedes to beat the crap out of the Spanish and the Austrians. But hey, that's history for you. Eventually, what happens is that the geopolitical factors kind of outweigh the religious factors here, and that is Catholic France will pay Protestant Sweden to beat up on Catholic Austria and Catholic Spain. And you'll also have a lot of things going off here on the side as well. With the basically, if the French aren't screwing with the Spanish, the British are screwing with the Spanish, and so you'll have piracy, you'll have state-sponsored terrorism, like no joke, it's ridiculous. But long story short is that the Spanish will get ground down, not only from forces inside, but forces outside. And so it's literally a death of 1,000 cuts. But it's slow. It takes literally about 200 years for them to really kind of go. But once they're done, this is literally you'll have liberation of Mexico. You'll have Simon Bolivar, who will basically just break out Gran Colombia, among with other states that basically liberate South America very quickly. And then you have, I think, the ultimate kind of coup de grace here, which ends at the 1800s and opens up the 1900s, is the Spanish-American War, which completely sees the Americans just, the upstart American nation just raffle stomp these folks. And it's bad. And this is the last colonial possessions the Spanish really ever have, particularly in the New World, is that Cuba becomes independent. You'll have Puerto Rico, and you'll have the Philippines become colonial possessions of the Americans, or just granted in wholesale independence. And so that's kind of the end of Spain. Portugal had a different route. Portugal largely kind of had like a lot more of an even heel. They had an area of growth, and they kind of had their golden era too, and then they had their decline. But it's nothing in the regard that like the Spanish did. Like the Spanish went really, really up and then really, really down. This is a lot more even, and so it's a lot more gradual and increase, and a lot more gradual and decrease. And Portugal is actually one of the few people that keep their colonial possessions until very, very late. So what they do is that they go out and they make trade posts like everybody else does, but they don't conquer a huge heaping area of territory. They'll stop in, they'll literally kind of like make an exclave, and they'll be like, hey, this is ours. But instead of coming in like the British or anybody else will, they'll just kind of say, hey, this is ours. You can come in, you can have a chat, but you rule everything outside of the enclave, and then we just rule everything in here. And so you have Goa in India and Macau in China that will actually outlast or be relative to everyone else's decolonization. There's a few places that they'll take in Africa, but mostly everyone will take it from them, excluding a few things. East Timor is actually another one, is that the Portuguese will actually own that. Just a little enclave here, instead of part of being the whole Indonesia, like the Dutch will take. They'll just take this literally one half of an island in the Indonesian archipelago. It's one of the bigger islands, but hey, not huge. And Anyway, so like just kind of give you an idea here is they kind of they poke it out the map a little bit, and they'll have pieces here, and every now and again they'll lose one, but more often than not they'll keep them, and they'll actually become a major financial and economic power under people. Well, this is more earlier than this, but you'll have people like Henry the Navigator kind of go out, and he's actually the kind of the guy who starts the age of exploration and deep sea navigation. But then you'll have people that follow suit, and you'll get like the colonizers, but they're a lot more benevolent than a lot of the other colonies are. So here you are, and I mean, there's a lot I can go into. I would say the number one reason Hispania loses presence, I forgot to actually mention this in history, is the same reason that Italy and Greece kind of goes to shit too. And this is actually deep water navigation, which is something that the Spanish, the Iberians, pioneer. I'm sorry, the Hispanians, the Iberians. This is actually pioneered by Spain and Portugal. They are the ones that actually are like the early navigators that actually set sail and look for strange new worlds, right? And that is, Henry the Navigator, which we talked about. We talked about CC, Christopher Columbus. And, it's people that are looking for pathways to India. And the reason why, if quick geopolitical history here, is that you have the spice trade. You have the Silk Road, right? Everyone's trying to bring stuff across Eurasia because, things aren't equally located. You don't have China outside of China. I'm talking about the porcelain ware, if anyone's not kind of wondering. You'll have Indian spice, and then Indonesia. You'll have a lot of spices there, like paprika and pepper are actually from these regions. And you'll have that where people want that. You'll have silk from China. A whole bunch of things that people want to get to. Well, to get all the way across Eurasia takes a lot of time, right? It takes a lot of money, too. Not only to get it there, but it's stupidly expensive when it finally gets all the way around, right? And so what you have is that geopolitically, this is a huge threat to the Europeans because it empowers their greatest enemies, particularly the Muslim hordes. Or if you want to put it in a more statist form, you'll talk about like the Ottoman Empire. Stupidly huge, stupidly wealthy, stupidly powerful. It scares the hell out of Europeans. Like, I mean, just to kind of give you guys, we talked about this in the Turkish episode to some degree. Feel free to check out the Turkey episode. But the Ottoman Empire is so powerful that it'll take Austria, Poland, and Russia all at the same time against them to really kind of put them under heel. And so what Spain does and what Portugal does is that they think there's two routes. One is to go all the way around the Horn of Africa, and they can get there, which they all kind of know that's the case, or at least have an idea, because they know that there's a continent right below Europe, but they don't know exactly how far it goes. But they figure eventually you can get around it. And then because there's like tales. People knew that there was the Kingdom of Mali and whatnot. And they knew that there eventually was water around it. So they just wanted to figure out the way to get there, because they knew they were 99% sure they could. You have CC, he's not really the guy to prove this, right? People started figuring out the world was round for quite a while, and it really started coming back, at least among the nobility, about 100 years before this. But he's the guy that says, hey, look, mathematically, I'm pretty sure that India is actually only 300 or 3,000 miles that way. And so instead of sailing around Africa, which we're still trying to figure out how exactly far that is, I'm going to go the other way. Because the Earth is a sphere, and I can go that way. Well, it turns out he was off about 10,000 miles, but that was the whole idea. And they go out amongst the world, and they try to find the ways to India. And the long story short, the reasons why Spain becomes so powerful is because they're the first to do it. They're the first to make use of it. The Portuguese will largely become the traders of that relationship, and the Spanish will become the colonizers. And they'll, take the New World. We had that. What brings it down is two things. One, their own system kind of bites them in the ass, because the people who were particularly adept at using deep sea navigation is not the Spanish or the Portuguese. It's the English. And just think about it this way. While a lot of France or a lot of Spain has a lot of coastline, and let's just say anywhere between half to 2/3 of their borders are coastline, England has everything. of their coastline. And the long story short here is that even if you have a small border, such as the Spanish-French border, which is is it the Pyrenees? I can't remember for sure. You have a significant land interaction there that compels your resources to become a land power. The British never had to deal with this, and so they could have armies during the start of World War I that literally is 100,000 dudes, but you've got this massive Omega screw you navy that is able to beat the living crap out of stuff. If you're just talking about a thing of size throughout the imperial era, the Spanish Navy and the French Navy were large throughout almost the entire time. In fact, they were usually two-thirds what the English Navy was at any given point. What generally tends to happen is the British were just better at everything, figuring out how these technologies work, at being a naval doctrine, and actually bringing their ships to bear. And you'll have them literally kind of kick them out of the colonial game, slowly but surely. And then, of course, there's a little bit of fuckery between everybody. Like the French will screw over the Spanish. And then anyone else who decided to get a boat would screw over the Spanish. Got pretty bad for the Spanish. But the long and short here is that this is kind of the rise and the fall. And how this whole system goes. And so you get the modern era. The end of the empire kind of comes around 1900. We talked about this with the Spanish-American War. The Portuguese are on the decline, but it's really slow. I mean, everyone else is kind of just at the behest of the British as far as a naval entity is concerned. They've got India at this point. They have massive colonial possessions, and it's all built around basically Eurasian trade, except now you put it on a boat in India or Indonesia or Singapore, and you just go the long way around because it's better than empowering your enemies. And this is actually what brings the end of the Ottomans. This all goes to crap, this system, this century, in the 1900s. The Spanish basically get all their crap taken from them. The Portuguese no longer have the political power to do so, and this is during the Cold War, right? Decolonization. It's not cool to be a colonizer anymore, and so they'll largely just walk away from that. And so that's kind of the end of the empire for them. Though the way that the whole system breaks down for everybody else is that you have World Wars I and II, which stress the systems out to the limit, and then they just break. And you'll have to have the actual biggest powers remaining, which is the United States and the Soviet Union, kind of vie for global dominance. But yeah, that's its own kind of weird thing, right? So, Marks, keep me on track, because there's 1,000 things that my brain decided it wanted to go after today. Yeah. But keep me on track. What do you want to know? What questions do you got?
You asked me to remind you about the Catalonia and the Basque regions. You wanted to go back to there?
Sure, I can. So the Basque people, I kind of elaborated on, were like they're their own people. They're not French. They're not Spanish. They are kind of the remnants of the Celts, and it's weird because they're assimilated but not assimilated. It's kind of like they're a relic of the old world, and yet they still exist in the modern era, and they just kind of take them subservience, I guess, to the peoples that are around them. They don't like everybody, but they're just like, they know they don't have the numbers, the geopolitical power to form their own state. And they kind of get along with folks. Now, the other conversation here is Catalonia. Now, Catalonia, I don't know its history on how it really gets started. The Catalan people are seen as having their own particular culture. But as far as I'm aware, they're not considered like their own ethnic group or ethno-national group. So it's weird. They've got like a microculture, if you will. And they categorically refuse to call themselves Spanish to a large degree. Or at least they have no intention of being part of the Spanish throne. Even though one, it's now a republic. But more in particular is that they speak Spanish. Unless I checked. I don't believe there's a Catalan language. And so it's just kind of weird. There's kind of like this cultural, historical like holdover, where these people are actually been constantly vying for independence. And I would probably assume that if it wasn't for the fact that most of the EU members want Spain to kind of stay there in that way, I wouldn't be surprised if the French actually decided one day to say, you know what, we're going to support Catalonia's independence. But so far that hasn't happened, and there's a whole political mess around Catalonia. So I think that gives you guys a summation. I apologize. There's a level where, like, Catalonia, I don't want to touch because it's politically charged as hell.
Okay.
It's EU. So, next.
I get that. I think you talk throughout your history, you talked about how Spain and France like teamed up occasionally to fight the British. To my knowledge, like Spain and France, they've been competitors throughout history. Like, what did the British do that was so bad that made them ally a bunch of times against them? Like, how were the British a
I might have.
pain in like Spain's ass?
Oh, okay, so I might have said this wrong. There's like there's like 2 or 3 times where the Spanish and the French do get together and kind of work together, uh, and like more times they kind of just don't look at each other in the positive light. But let me kind of rehash the history a little bit here and see if I can kind of square the circle for anyone who's a little confused. During the 30 Years' War, the Holy Roman Emperor is a Habsburg, and he's Charles V of Spain. Now, if anyone doesn't know who the Habsburgs are after watching my show still, is that they were the rulers of Austria at the time. And so you have the Holy Roman Empire under the Archduchy Empire of Austria, and then you have Spain become part of that dynasty. And actually the Spanish crown will rule the Holy Roman Empire for a quick minute, and Austria gets sidelined. And that's actually just kind of a show of how powerful Spain does get at this point. This is the colonial era. This is the 1500s, where you have the guy beat up on Montezuma. What the hell was his name? I can't remember the conquistadors' names off the top of my head for a second. But anyway, what happens is that eventually Spain and Herman Cortez. Thank you very much. Good to see you, ABC. Anyway, what tends to happen is that during the 30 Years' War, Spain and France are rivaled, but Spain completely dominates that conversation because it was Spain, the HRE. Spain, the HRE, kind of comes into Guerre, and they kind of beat up on France. France will get away with it by basically paying the Swedes to do their fighting for them, and then after that, in Europe, Spain goes into decline. We talked about the Dutch. We talked a little bit about Naples, but I don't remember exactly how they break away. But Spain starts losing in Europe. Pretty bad, actually. And the long story short here is that other players become powerful enough to where the Spanish and the French don't have to be at odds with each other because somebody else is bigger, more of a big deal. This is the era where Britain becomes on the rise, and this is eventually the beginning of the Royal Navy. You'll eventually see the 13 colonies, and then later in India, and then you have Austria, which is eventually after the Ottomans start going to crap, they get stupidly strong as well. You'll have the rise of what is Prussia at a given point, and so more people to fight. Other part is kind of cultural and part of holdovers of the feudal era, and then you'll get more of the nationalistic stuff that we'll hit here in a second. So the feudal conversation is that back when these were still kingdoms, the War of the Spanish Secession fires off. And this is around 1700, if I remember. Like 1701 is when this happens. The king of Spain will eventually die, and somebody has to inherit the throne. Who it is Philip the Seventh or something like that on the line. Sorry, I need to have aristocracy here. She can set my monarch straight for me really, really easily. But the long and the short here is that this Philip is the grandson of the current king of France. And that puts him in line for not only the Spanish throne, but the French throne. And you'll have another United Kingdom dual monarchy situation in Europe. And that scares the living hell out of everybody. Because Spain and France together in one state, in one kingdom, inherited formally. Holy shit.
Hmm.
Like, for all you can say, France is on the upcoming here, even though Spain's kind of in decline. You put that together, that's a massive geopolitical entity. And somebody's saying in chat that war is basically Europe versus France. I would say it's Europe versus Hispania and France, but yes, it's basically all of Europe tag teams, Avengers style, upon France and Spain. And basically the long and that short of that war will be that the Philip has to give up the claim to the French throne. He can rule Spain, he can rule France, but he can't rule both. And I could be wrong. He might actually give up his claim to the Spanish throne so he can inherit France. I don't remember off the top of my head. I apologize. But that's the rule, is that you couldn't dual inherit, and so they had to be their own thing. Which is hilarious, mind you, because the French and the Spanish are largely going to be on the same playbook outside of a few given instances. So, given examples, France, Catholic. Austria, Catholic. Spain, Catholic. Anytime that the Protestants get yuppie, the Spanish and the French and the Austrians tend to coalesce around each other and try to fight them back. And a lot of this will actually be the British versus the French and the Spanish. All those wars I was talking about with the British and the Spanish, that'll happen a lot. And the French will usually support them either blatantly or on the side. And so, geopolitically, it makes sense for them to be on the same side. The only times this kind of breaks away for the entire time after basically 1700 is the Peninsular War, where Napoleon had Spain as an ally, decided that, nah, you weren't good an ally enough, so I'm going to put my brother on the throne, and then Spain goes to complete shit, and they have to fight the Peninsular War. Oops. Well done. So that's in the 1800s. And then you'll have pretty much the end of Spain as a major geopolitical force, to where they won't be in any major conflict that I can think of in the late, or pretty much the second 2/3 of the 1800s. And then you kind of have them roll into the modern era. So I hope that answers that question.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah, that answered my question. As far as you may have touched on it a little bit, but I'd like you to elaborate more. What really powered? Did the geography help empower Spain to become a major world player? Like, what about Spain's geography help?
Oh, okay, yeah. So we might as well just tackle this in the geography section. But if we need to go back, we can.
Sorry.
The geopolitical structure of Hispania is a little fucked. Yes, I got a new mic. It's fantastic. I hope you love it. Anyway, what Hispania is that most of it's a semi-arid desert. It's actually kind of on a plateau. It's like a couple 100 feet up, if not a couple 1,000 feet up, literally straight off the water. So there's not a lot of natural ports here. Contrary to it being a giant peninsula, right? And it doesn't get a lot of rain, semi-arid desert. So it kind of sucks. Now there's one area that really isn't the case, and it's the most western part of the peninsula. But who owns 7/8 of the western part of the peninsula? Portugal. And so most of Portugal, which granted the southern half of Portugal kind of sucks, but the northern part pretty solid. But yeah, Galicia and Portugal are largely the good, like, temperate zones here that are good for building out a country. But because of the topography, where it's largely hilly, if not mountainous, and very arid, is that basically the hills and the mountains kind of squeeze out all the water, to where by the time it gets to Madrid, which is damn near in the center of the peninsula, it's getting squeezed dry. Now, I'm not going to say this area doesn't get rain. It's semi-arid, but it's like West Texas, right? It's, you'll see tumbleweeds and whatnot. Of course, I don't think they have tumbleweeds over there. So yeah, the whole thing is this: the geography is that it doesn't generate what a lot of what we would think of in a modern geopolitical structure as a very strong and powerful state. It just doesn't have the river network to generate capital. It doesn't have enough rain to really generate a good agricultural amenity. And the resources are kind of meh. It doesn't have a lot of coal. It doesn't have a lot of iron. Um, it's weird because it's continental crust, but it doesn't have a lot of the things that really work out for people. The only thing that really did start out with, for as far as I'm aware, is actually has a large amount of precious metals, silver, gold, that kind of thing. But it only works until you run out. And of course, a lot of their history is literally getting mined and invaded for it, particularly during the Romans and the early medieval era. So the final note I'll make is the coastline. 7/8 of their of the Hispania coastline is borders our coastline. The only country that it borders, and the only major power it borders, is France, and that's literally over a mountain range. It's literally one of the most insulated areas ever. It's really easy to defend, and if you unite it all together into one thing, it works pretty well. Problem is, one, they never did because Portugal. Number two is that it's really hard to keep together because it has the same similar topography as northern Mexico. It's semi-arid, if not arid, and it's hilly as crap. And building out a modern nation state and that kind of thing just sucks because that means a lot of infrastructure, which means that you need to have a lot of capital, and that kind of reinforces each other, right? You don't have the capital to make the infrastructure, you don't really have a state. And this is why you get splinter regions like, you get a lot of splinter regions that are Catalonia and the Basque, which we already talked about. Just a recap question. Didn't the Spanish colonize South America and get those resources instead? Yeah, we talked about that in the history section where you have Spain at its height. But the problem is that, like, if we're talking like an extraction-based economy, it only works for so long. You need to continually generate capital. And, you can steal people's capital and their resources for a time. But if you still don't have the ability to generate your own, eventually somebody's going to eclipse you, particularly if you can generate it in-house. And that's what happens with pretty much every major empire, is that if you can't do it in-house, somebody else who can will. And this is kind of the last 100 years in a nutshell. Or actually, the last 120. All right, so I think that answers that question from the chat and that whatever. So that's geography. We've got about 10 minutes left if we want to keep hitting a few things, or if we have any questions for the audience. I suppose we can do that. But go ahead, Marks, if you got anything.
Give about 20 seconds for the audience, and then I'll think of a question. Ask a question.
Think of one means I don't have one.
I know, because I don't know that much about Hispania, but I can probably think of one.
No, that's no problem. But yeah, chat, if you want to hit this up, feel free to do so. We always appreciate questions from the chat, or at least whenever we get time. Some people get impatient, and that's fine. I get that.
Looking at a map of Spain and just knowing generally where it at, was Spain like? I feel like how do I ask this question? Is it true that Spain made a lot of their wealth from like controlling the entry into the Mediterranean Sea? From that part,
there's a
because
level, there's a level where that's a little bit true, but not really. You can kind of do a sound hole. Which is the whole point of that is like wherever there's a strait, you can basically put cannons up on each side and kind of charge people ransom to go through, or if you will, just call it a tariff or a toll, right? Spain could do that if they wanted to, and they did a little bit. But the problem with the problem with the that kind of situation is that the Mediterranean, in the point that where Spain is actually the least profitable and the least capital generating of the whole part of the Mediterranean. Most of the wealth that was gained from the Mediterranean throughout history was its endpoint of the Silk Road that kind of terminated in Europe, and this is the Aegean Sea in particular. That is a huge part here. This is what actually makes Greece such an amazing power, and then the Romans and the Ottomans that's where most of the economic activity is going on. both in materials and goods and transfers. And then with the end of the Silk Road, that kind of leaves. But the problem is that while a lot of this will come out in like the Italian states, whether it's the trade routes of Rome or the Italian city states that are kind of built up with Venice and whatnot, the problem is that Spain doesn't really get any of that, because it'll either go north through Europe into Germany and then Holland and then maybe into England, or it sailed the long way around, and particularly after deep sea navigation, is that the only time the Spanish can really intercept something without actually going to war over it is when it goes right through the straits. And the problem is, throughout most of history, it's not actually very used. The only time it was used as a whole given area here is during the 1900s with the invention of the Suez Canal, because then you can shorten the trip by 10 days today, or literally months back then, where you went, instead of going all the way around the Horn of Africa, which is a 10,000-mile trip, you can go through the Straits of Gibraltar, through the Mediterranean, and down through the Suez Canal out to the Red Sea. That's largely with the British imperial era, and that means that you have Gibraltar, which is already taken by the British, which kind of interferes a little bit with the Spanish's ability to hold the area, because basically you need a giant navy, and somebody already has a giant navy there, and it's the Brits. And so the Brits are basically able to keep that opened up for themselves, and they don't have to pay anyone's toll. So the Spanish kind of just lose their geopolitical prominence on being able to make Gibraltar any kind of thing. One, because it never really was, but more in particular, that whenever the chance came up, they were already playing second fiddle to the Brits. So bad timing. Discrepancy that people are trying to point out that I have to hit. So here's the problem with Gibraltar as a whole. The strait where between the Horn of Africa, or not Horn of Africa, excuse me, the tip of Africa and the bottom of Spain, it's 7 miles. It is known as the Straits of Gibraltar. So keep that in mind. There is also the Rock of Gibraltar, which is this little enclave owned by the British, which has a naval base and an airstrip on it. That's also referred to as Gibraltar. I am sorry, that's a pain in the ass. Now, technically, Gibraltar is not right there at the tip. This is where it gets even weirder. There is an area that's closer, but Gibraltar's off about 10 miles up the coast. So not quite what you're all thinking, but it works for the weird way that history and geography does work. So go ahead, buddy. What do you got?
Based off of that, that pretty much answered my question. I don't really have any more questions besides that.
I gotcha. I guess I can answer this question, although it's weird. I heard from Richard Wolff, he's a socialist economist, okay, that Spain has this big co-op that is super successful there, and I like your thoughts about co-ops. Okay, that's going to be an AMA question, but there is a massive co-op that is owned by the Spanish. That does exist, and I can't remember what it's called, but the socialists just love to talk about it. But we'll definitely talk about that in the AMA section here in just a second. So, I've been Tyberius D. I've been joined by Daddy Marks. I almost called you Carl for a second. I think it is time that we change up the name. I could be wrong, but let's have a chat about that one. But anyway, I've been joined by Daddy Marks. I've been Tiberius D. We've been talking geopolitics for the last hour. It's good to be back. It's actually fun once I really get going with it. But we're going to be working more on Europe as we go into. We talk about North America, which are more my specialties. We're going to be working with a few things that are coming up and kind of getting redressed here. So things to look forward to if you're a fan of the show, that you watch the show. Italy will be the next episode that we're going to do. And I apologize for not keeping my schedule, but we should be good here. Next week, we'll be continuing for wealth and trade. We'll be getting back to macroeconomics. I'm sorry I skipped this week, but we'll be getting there. And we're going to be talking about Greece, followed by a serious discussion on the end of liberalism. I think this one's going to be fun. We'll be hitting it up the following week with capitalism, which is part of For Wealth and Trade, followed by Poland and hopefully geopolitics and gaming. We're going to be talking about how geopolitics reflects your gaming, whether you're playing games that reflect geopolitics. It's going to be an interesting time. Thank you all very much for listening. I thank you very much for watching, and we'll catch you again next time.